Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Norsewoods Podcast, the show where we talk about these tales from Norse mythology and discuss the meaning behind them. I'm your host, Everett.
And I'm here, Colleen.
Yeah, I have a lot to go over contextually for this show, why we're doing it, and just some disclaimers at the beginning. But to explain, I'll be the host and I'll be going through the material. But I want Colleen on the show as well because to me, she is like the virgin ears of the listeners because she has no exposure. Well, she has exposure, but not a whole lot of knowledge of Norse mythology.
Everett is the one who has massive interest in Norse mythology. So this is all fairly new to me.
Yeah, and I mean, everyone has exposure to the Marvel versions of Norse mythology, right? Thor, Odin, and Loki.
Right.
And I mean, they do draw some inspiration, but this is going to be new. So if that's your introduction to Norse mythology, this is going to be very different. So just to kind of introduce what this podcast is and a few disclaimers, like I said, first thing I want to say at the top in regards to pronunciation, I'm going to do my best to pronounce things as they should, with some exceptions. So Odin, I'm going to say Odin. That's how everyone knows Odin. But technically, I mean, I know, you don't have to tell me that his name is Odin. And things with like the Aesir should probably be Aesir, but I call it the Aesir. But other than, some small exceptions, I'm going to be doing my best to pronounce things correctly. Also, religion in general. This is an old religion, right? And I want to kind of introduce why I want to do this. So, as most of you know, religion in general across the world has been on the decline for the past several decades. But interestingly, Norse mythology is on the rise, especially with COVID, too. A lot of more people are getting into it.
I think that, quote unquote, paganism in general is on the rise. Mm-hmm. In terms of people, I don't want to say like people are turning away from Christianity, but it seems that every couple decades there's a pagan revival, and you can bring that all the way back to like Victorian era. Sure,
and just not even just paganism, but religion in general. It goes in cycles. So there's revivals of interest in Christianity, Islam, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to say that I'm not really an exception at all to this, like, increase in interest in Norse paganism or paganism in general. Over the past couple years, especially since COVID hit, I've been reading more and more about the Old Norse, and I have found the stories from the Poetic and the Prose Eddas extremely intriguing, but in many cases, it's been leaving me with more questions than I had before I started. So that's why I wanted to do this. And for context, the meaning of the term Edda in reference to these things I just said, it refers to the collections of stories that were in Scandinavian poetry, but the actual meaning behind that word Edda is not agreed upon because it is lost to time. So it just refers to these stories now.
Okay.
Old Norse is considered by many to be a dead religion, and in some instances, I can't disagree with that. The written texts we have are limited, and in some cases, they're contradictory. I have seen some claims that an estimated 90% of the stories of the Old Norse were never documented and have therefore been lost to time, especially after the introduction of Christianity. Context for some portions of these stories we have are lost, and one of the two major sources of written text that we do have needs to be taken with a huge grain of salt. So this is the Prose Edda, and this was written in whole or in majority by a man named Snorri Sturluson, and he was a historian and a political leader of Iceland from the 12th and 13th centuries. So what the Prose Edda was, this was a collection of poems and stories that were put down on paper, and for some time was the only documented source of Old Norse stories until the manuscripts of the Poetic Edda were discovered or rediscovered in the second half of the 13th century after Snorri's passing. The poems that are compiled in the Poetic Edda were written by unknown authors between 800 and 1100. The Poetic Edda, sometimes referred to as the Elder Edda, is a more trusted source of knowledge since we have direct translations from authors who practiced the religions and were from the culture. The reason that the Prose Edda needs to be read with a little more caution is because Snorri was a Christian, and many do assume that some of the stories were slightly altered to be more appealing to a Christian audience.
So I have a question before you carry on. These texts are from, at the latest, the 13th century.
The Prose Edda was Snorri's, or at least mostly Snorri's, authorship, but were translated or taken from manuscripts and other poetry from Scandinavia. So it's all from the same source material. So there is a lot of overlap between the prose and Poetic Edda, but the prose was definitely written by Snorri, or in part by him, in the 1200s and 1300s.
Okay. So my question is, you said that by that time, a lot of Old Norse mythology and religion was lost to time. I mean, that's already 800 years ago. How far back does Norse religion, of this type of Old Norse religion, go? Sure.
So, I mean, of course, depending on the actual area, it will change. And I mean, this is a large area that practiced or believed in these stories. Anywhere from all of Scandinavia to Northern Europe, like Germany, Denmark, also eventually into Iceland after the Viking Age, and they settled that area. So, of course, there's going to be differences, but the time frame, we're not even quite sure, but it goes back thousands of years, these stories.
Okay.
But after the introduction of Christianity around 1000, that's when, people were converted and stopped practicing these slowly over time.
Sure. Because when I think, like, if I'm going to go picture people practicing Norse religion, I'm picturing like the Vikings that plundered Ireland in the 11 and 1200s. I mean, this goes way farther back than that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Viking Age was the death of Norse mythology.
Okay, interesting.
That's the end, I should say, at least as it once was.
Well, because then they're expanding into places that
but it was more so Christianity that killed Norse mythology.
Right.
But Old Norse may be a dead religion, but there has been a revival in Norse paganism. So new generations are worshiping the old gods, and they are drawing from pagan religions like Wicca to fill in the gaps. So I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, as long as we can acknowledge when practices are new or traditional. This is why I wanted to start the podcast, and I'm definitely no expert, and I am learning more and more in real time as we're going to release content.
Neither of us are in any way experts on Norse mythology or religion.
But I have read both the Prose and Poetic Edda. I've read some other poetry from the time that's not included, but this is definitely something I didn't grow up with. It's something I'm recently getting into.
For context, we were both raised in the Roman Catholic Church.
Right. And I think that's going to be the case with a lot of pagans in general, not just Norse pagans, but pagans in the United States seem to be Catholic, but definitely Christian in their upbringing.
One thing I have to say about that is I feel like Catholicism it's held on to a lot of its original traditions, which were taken from pagan traditions in some cases.
In part, yeah.
And so to me, Catholicism has the most magical feel to it.
It's definitely very ritualistic.
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah. So my goal, since I'm learning as we're going, is to provide the stories as we have them today and do my best to explain the context of why the Old Norse may have believed in these stories. And I also want to talk about how modern Norse paganism is taking this context and applying it today, and how things may have changed.
And I'm here to learn and ask questions.
Yes. So Norse paganism today is decentralized, at least mostly, and that's probably how it was in ancient times too. There is one official religion in Iceland called Asatru, and this is a really interesting religion, church, whatever you want to call it. It's started, I believe, in the 70s, and there were only 12 declared members, but now they have thousands and thousands of members, and it's the fastest growing religion in Iceland. And I don't know if it's second to just Christianity, in general, but it's definitely up there.
Out of curiosity, did they have like specific texts and rituals that they follow as like a group that you could access, even if you didn't want to necessarily become part of that religion, but you wanted to practice Old Norse. And
yeah, I mean, they have gotten some flack because they do things a little differently from other pagans, and they're much more accepting of like the LGBTQ community and just things that, weren't really thought of as an issue thousands of years ago. So a lot of people, stupid, shitty people don't really like them for that reason, but they're very open, not gatekeepy at all.
That's the thing I was going to bring up about a lot of paganism today. There are a lot of gatekeepers, which is interesting because for a lot of pagan religions, there's no complete knowledge of how to practice said religions. And I think like even back then, it was a personal spiritualism as opposed to when Christianity came and it became like group rituals.
Right.
That's just a guess of mine, but it is interesting how people have glommed onto paganism and then been very gatekeepy about
letting people in. Teaching.
Right, which is interesting because it is a personal belief.
And I mean, some Norse pagans are going to have that mentality, but I think overall Norse paganism compared to others or other forms of paganism and just minor religions in general, they tend to be a lot more open. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So just aside from the Asatru, there's a lot of other terms for the Norse pagans. Some call themselves heathens and practicing heathenry. Others simply just call themselves pagans or Norse pagans. But what I did want to bring up just a second ago is this last important disclaimer before we get into the actual topic of the episode. So in recent years, there have been several white supremacist organizations that have been associating with Asatru and Norse paganism in general. And of course, I just want to say this podcast doesn't associate with that at all.
We're not about that.
Yeah, we're not going to promote racist ideals or associate with anyone who does. As we just talked about, modern Norse paganism is known among general pagans to be one of the most welcoming forms of paganism. And I think that's really important to note because when we look at the news and stuff, the negative news is the most eye-catching and gets the most clicks. So we just want to say it's not about that.
Right. I mean, a lot of people have associations with the Sons of Odin. Like when you think Norse paganism today, you're thinking perhaps some white supremacist group, and that's like the smallest minority of believers. And they just happen to be the loudest.
Yes. So kind of just to quickly, and I know we've talked a little bit about ourselves, but for anyone who doesn't know who we are, Colleen and I have lived in the upper Midwest of the United States for our entire lives, and we're currently living in the Northwoods of Minnesota. So the choice to name this podcast the Norsewoods Podcast seemed like an obvious choice. And in this first episode, we're going to start at the beginning. We're going to be talking about the creation story in Norse mythology, as well as the importance of the world tree Yggdrasil.
Awesome. My question for you is, where is this creation story from? How do you know this is the original creation story?
That's a good question. I should have said that. So this next story that I'm going to read, it's something I wrote in summary, but it's drawing from both the Prose and Poetic Edda. And there's going to be a couple slight differences that I'll make sure to note while I'm reading it between the two of them.
But this is the idea that this was the original creation story as believed by Old Norse pagans.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk about the context behind it after I read it through it. This is one of the most well-documented stories, and this is something that wasn't definitely not lost to time because it's one of the more popular stories.
Got it.
So, in the beginning, there was nothing. No water, land, air, or even light. And there was only the never-ending abyss called Ganongagap. From this void, two separate realms appeared. A land of cold, snow, and ice called Niflheim. The other realm was a land of fire called Muspel. And as the two realms met, fire melted ice. The drops of water formed the very first of the Jotun, or the first giant, and his name, or their name, I should say, is Ymir. The first giant was massive, and all giants descended from him. He is both male and female. And another being came from the ice of Niflheim. It was a cow named Athumala. Her milk gave nourishment to Ymir, and the salty rocks and Ymir's sweat nourished Athumala. The first generation of giants sprang from the sweat of Ymir's armpits, a male and a female. And while Ymir slept, his left and right legs mated with each other, producing a son. These Jotnar were the very first generation of giants, and all additional giants descended from them. Athumala licked at the ice of Niflheim, and the very first of the gods was uncovered. His name was Buri, and he took an unnamed wife. A lot of people do assume that it had to have been one of the Jotnar because there were no other gods. Together they had a son named Bor, who married a giantess named Bestla. And she was the daughter of the giant Bolthor, who was the son of the Jotnar who sprang from Ymir. Bor and Bestla had 3 sons, half god and half giant, and their names were Vili, Ve, and Odin. The 3 brothers, for no stated reason, killed Ymir. His remains created everything we know today. The oceans, lakes, and rivers were made from his blood. Land was made from his skin and muscles. His bones became mountains, and his teeth boulders. Maggots appeared in the rotting flesh of Ymir. The 3 brothers gave the maggots the appearance and intelligence of humans, and from the soil came the first dwarves. The plants from the earth were Ymir's hair, and the sky his skull. 4 dwarves hold Ymir's skull in place, each one standing at the cardinal directions, and their names translate to north, east, south, and west. Then the 3 gods throw Ymir's brains into the sky, and they are the clouds. Then Vili, Ve, and Odin decide it is time to build an enclosure to protect themselves from the giants. They build a defensive enclosure with the eyelashes of Ymir, and this is called Midgard. Now, according to the Prose Edda, while walking along the shore in Midgard, the 3 brothers find 2 pieces of wood. The Poetic Edda makes the distinction that the 3 who find these pieces of woods were not the 3 brothers, but they were Odin and 2 new characters named Honir and Loth. One of the pieces of driftwood was from an ash tree, and the other from an elm. Loth gave the pieces of wood the appearance of humans, Honir gave them souls, and Odin breathed life into them. These were the first man and woman, named Ask and Embla, translating to ash and elm, and Midgard was left to them. In the middle of everything they had created, the 3 brothers created a new stronghold sitting above Midgard. They named it Asgard, and in Asgard Odin took a wife. Her name was Frigg, and their children formed the tribe of gods known as the Aesir, and the Aesir inhabit Asgard. Midgard is a daughter to Odin, but also became his wife. From Odin and Midgard came Thor. Odin gave life to humans, dwarves, gods, and everything we know. This is why he is also known as the Allfather. And the Aesir built a bridge that allows them to travel from the heavens to Midgard and to the other realms. It is called the Bifrost, or more likely the Bifrost, and is a tricolored and very strong bridge. Some have made the connection that rainbows are Bifrost, but there is little to no evidence from the Prose or Poetic Eddas to confirm that. Bifrost is extremely strong and is believed that it will only break in the end when the sons of Muspel ride it. And that is the story of the creation.
There is a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
There were so many names and legs doing it with each other.
Yep. So I think the important points to make are there was nothing, then fire and ice collide. The water that is created creates Ymir, the first giant. Mm-hmm. The giants descended from him. Then the cow Athumala licks clean the ice, and the first of the gods come out. Then from them, they intermingle, mate, and then eventually Odin and his 2 brothers are born. And then they create life by killing Ymir, create the first of the dwarves, create humans, and all the realms we know.
Now, it's interesting because there doesn't seem to be a source of creation for those original 2 fire and ice realms, and the gods already seemed to reside in the ice. So where did they come from?
Very good question. I don't know if we're going to get to those questions today because we have to talk about Ragnarok. And we're not talking about Ragnarok today.
Okay, got you.
But let's provide some other context for this story. So I think it is safe to say that one person did not create this entire story.
No way.
It's a combination of many stories from across the Nordic region compiled into a single narrative. Much of this land was a harsh and dangerous place to live in. There were mountains, dense forests, rushing waves, and extreme cold. And it made sense to these people to believe that life was created when intense heat and cold met. Having a cosmic cow nourish the first living being made a lot of sense, because cows were, and just cattle in general, are very important to Northerners because it sustains life. But also, Ymir, as the first being, needed to be nourished from something. So having milk made sense because babies need milk.
Right.
So since the first being is there, it needs to sustain itself somehow. So that's why the cow is there.
Sure. Yes. And I can get how this is a conglomeration of like probably several variations on the creation story. Interesting how it's all compiled together. It very much reminds me of like the Old Testament in the Bible where they're like, and Melchizedek was born of Sarah, who was born of Malachi, who was born like.
Well, and it's actually interesting you say that because I left out the portions of the story that weren't super relevant.
Sure.
There's a list of all the dwarves that were created by name.
It's fascinating that they have like all of those names existed. It's not just the concept of dwarves. They've got individual names for individual ideas.
Yeah, and it's funny too because for those that don't know, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit draw a lot of inspiration from Norse mythology, and Gandalf and all the dwarves, all of their names come from that list.
Oh.
So it's actually Gandalfur.
Interesting.
Is one of the dwarves.
I did not know that.
So we can also hypothesize for context of this story that ancient people may have been more connected with nature than we are today. And because of this, they may have had some more of a natural understanding of how the universe was created. The reason that I say that is because Ymir is linguistically tied to words that translate to making sound, yelling, and moaning. So is it a coincidence that in this creation story, the first living being is a giant whose name means sound maker? Or did the Norse have a different interpretation of what we know of today as the Big Bang?
Ah, that seems a little bit conspiracy theory.
I mean, it's not really a conspiracy, but it's something that a lot of modern day pagans believe. The Norse definitely didn't know the Big Bang. They didn't know of that, but maybe they thought
they're talking about worlds colliding.
Right. And from nothing, which is very important, from nothing, life is created. And it's a sound.
And that is fascinating. I don't know many creation stories, but I do know that there are creation stories where it's not nothing. The concept of nothing doesn't exist. It's like the world was first an ocean or something. I wonder if it's a Christian belief, Judeo-Christian belief of nothing, then God created something, kind of stems from that original Norse idea of nothing.
Possibly. I mean, I don't know.
But, no idea. Just interesting.
Kind of going off of that, though. So the nothingness in this story is called Ganongagap. That could refer to the nothingness that existed before the Big Bang, but it could also just refer to space in general, because space is a vast void of nothingness. And that is actually, fairly advanced for the time, because when you look in the sky, you see a shit ton of stars, right? So you think it's full of stuff, but really it is, 99% nothing. It's just empty vacuum space. And the concept
of nothing, even now, is hard to fathom because we're surrounded by something. There's like matter and energy everywhere. So like the idea of being surrounded by complete nothingness is a lot. And
one other thing that kind of supports this idea that Ymir may be related to the idea of the Big Bang, a lot of people also view Muspel and Niflheim, their meeting together, as the catalyst for the Big Bang. So there had to be some sort of energy or event that happened before the Big Bang to cause that to happen.
Okay.
We'll eventually, as I said, talk about Ragnarok in a future episode, and we can talk about other parallels with that. But there is no, true way to know what the Old Norse believed beyond the documented stories that we have.
Sure.
But these types of connections do allow modern day pagans to believe in both spirituality as well as scientific evidence.
Yeah, and I like that. I'm interested though, was there no oral stories handed down?
No, there definitely were. It's just the problem is after everyone was converted to Christianity, those stories were lost to time because
People just
the stories
stopped telling them.
Well, not immediately. I mean, we do have some stories that were eventually written down, which is why the Prose and Poetic Edda exist. Those were the stories that were remembered and kept and written down. But after the Christians converted the Norse, the stories that were starting to be passed down instead were the stories of Jesus and the Bible.
Out of curiosity, was there a writing system?
There was. We eventually will do an episode on runes, but I'm
just interested. I'm thinking of a lot of indigenous American traditions and ancient stories have passed on because they have such a strong oral tradition that like those stories, even with Christianity having come ripping through the Americas, they've managed to maintain that strong oral history.
There was a writing system, and the Vikings during the Viking Age were actually fairly good at documenting their travels and their stories. But the Viking Age is a very small portion of Norse mythology or Old Norse culture. Before that, I mean, there was some, but really it is, for the most part, oral tradition.
It's interesting to me, though, because don't take this as fact. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but it seems like cultures that had things written down were able to write it down and then move on. And therefore, if those written documents were lost, they were lost and the ideas were lost. Whereas I feel like with cultures with like a strong oral history and oral tradition, tons of people knew the story and were continually passing it down and weren't relying on written texts to remember things.
That's very true.
I guess that was why I asked if there was a writing system.
No, that's very true. It's just the problem is, since Christianity was so immensely popular, people forgot the old ways.
Sure, right.
But now that we've talked about the creation story, let's talk about the world tree Yggdrasil.
Nice.
So the 9 realms, or at least the 9 known realms, are contained within the world tree Yggdrasil. The branches reach far into the heavens and the roots far below everything we know. The 9 realms are Asgard, Midgard, Muspel, Niflheim. We've already talked about those 4. But there's also Jotunheim, or Jotunheim, which is the home to the giants, Vanaheim, which is home to the rival tribe of gods called the Vanir, Elfheim, which is home to the elves, Svartalfheim, which is home to the dwarves, and Hel, which is the land of the dead. In the exact center of Yggdrasil is Asgard, home to the Aesir, and also home to Valhalla, which we will definitely talk about at length in the future. But sitting below Asgard is Midgard, home to humans, and the sea serpent Jormungandr. 3 main roots or root systems lie below Midgard, each leading to a well that nourishes Yggdrasil. One root leads to the well of Urd, one of the 3 Norns. And we will definitely be talking about the Norns at length in the future, but just for a quick summary, the Norns are the ones who write out the destiny of humans on the trunk of Yggdrasil. The Norns work with the Aesir, and they have regular access to this specific root system. The second root leads to Hvergelmir, a bubbling spring in Niflheim. The land of the dead, Hel, lies beneath that. And within this spring are countless snakes and the great dragon Nithogr, who gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil. The third root leads to Mimir's well, which lies in Jotunheim. We will discuss Mimir, his well, and Odin at length in the next episode. A squirrel named Ratuskr runs along the length of Yggdrasil, and he speaks with the dragon Nithogr, in the roots, and a great wise eagle on the top branches of Yggdrasil. He spreads slander and gossip to aggravate these two, to make them fight. Meanwhile, between his trips, the squirrel gnaws at the bark of Yggdrasil, which continually grows back. And that's just a very brief summary of Yggdrasil. But one thing I will say, We do have some context for the locations on the world tree where certain realms lie, but others don't make too much sense. So it's difficult to picture this as an actual tree and more of just the system that connects the realms.
Well, and that was the very first question that came to my mind. They can't be talking about a literal tree because we just heard in the creation story about how all of those realms were created. At what point did a tree come into the picture? So I'm wondering if a tree is just some visual way.
It could be. One thing I will say, though, Ymir, his corpse and all of his stuff created Earth. Mm-hmm. And Earth is Midgard.
Mm-hmm.
Midgard is just a portion of the world tree.
Right.
So the idea is if someone were to believe that Yggdrasil is an actual tree, Earth and everything on it is just a very small portion, and it extends far beyond Earth.
Sure. So the tree is kind of like today's concept of the universe.
Right, exactly.
Now, where'd this squirrel and eagle dragon come from? Like what?
They're not super important players in the overall stories in Norse mythology. The dragon and the roots, Nithogr, is a little more important. The other two, not so much.
Why is the squirrel such an asshole?
He's just a little trickster dude.
All right.
But what he does, eating at the bark, that will play an important part in the context of Yggdrasil.
Okay.
So let's talk about that. There's definitely a lot of different interpretations of what Yggdrasil is, far more than there are ideas of the creation story, because a lot of those are cut and dry. Mm-hmm. But Yggdrasil is a little more abstract. So some people probably did think that Yggdrasil was a truly massive tree in which everything was contained.
Sure.
People were, we didn't have a whole lot of knowledge when it came to astronomy or even if the Earth was round or not. I mean, before the Viking Age, at least.
Sure.
So I'm sure a lot of people did think it was an actual tree based on the stories. However, some likely used a tree as a symbolic interpretation of all life.
Right. And that's kind of what I was picturing. I mean, it's easier to picture and describe a tree than to try to describe some metaphysical idea of the order of life,
right,
and universes.
And that's why I actually don't like calling Yggdrasil the world tree. I personally, and this is just my opinion, I think of it as the cosmic tree. Mm-hmm. It's just a symbol for the universe. That's what I think. So the idea that Yggdrasil is an interpretation of all life in general is supported by the actual translated meaning of Yggdrasil. So the literal translation, Ygg, refers to one of Odin's many names. He has like dozens and dozens of different names, and that's just because of the different cultures that worshipped Odin.
Sure.
Drasil translate to horse. So this is a compound term that would refer to Odin's horse, but this doesn't really make much sense because it's referring to a tree, not to a horse. But what does make sense is the metaphor involved. So over the centuries, several translators have interpreted Odin's horse as a metaphor for a gallows tree. A similarity was noted between the bobbing of a body as one rides a horse compared to the bobbing of a corpse after it is hung from a tree. So Odin's horse is a symbol for the terrible one's gallows tree. And that being said, ancient Scandinavians possibly did not view Yggdrasil as a literal tree, but rather as the thing that holds all life together, which is the inevitable death of all life. So it's only fitting that Yggdrasil has the connection to being symbolic for a gallows tree, because next episode we're going to be talking about Odin's quest for knowledge and his hanging. One last point that needs to be said is the human connection to Yggdrasil. So in that creation story, if you remember, I don't think it's a coincidence that Odin and the other gods created humans out of the remains of a tree. They were created from driftwood. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we're plants or tree people, but I think it's symbolic that our bodies are made out of the same material that makes up Yggdrasil or the universe. So we are made from wood from Yggdrasil in the same way that all matter is made from ancient stardust from across the universe. So it just
parallels.
It all connects.
Yeah. That interpretation seems more scientific than I would have imagined.
I mean, I'm definitely not arguing that the Old Norse had any knowledge of the Big Bang or the universe or how it works. But I think it is interesting. And maybe, this is just applying meaning to something that wasn't there.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting that, these people, and not just in Scandinavia, but from across the world during this time, they're much more connected to nature than we are today. Just, living in cities and having everything we do now. We're not out in the mountains and the forest like they were. Mm-hmm. So they probably have, and this sounds like a little hippy dippy, but they had a little more of a grounded connection to the earth. And
well, they relied on it much more.
Right. Of course. I think they're just drawing information that they're naturally susceptible to learning.
Right. That's interesting that they would come to a completely different but similar conclusion to scientists of today.
Right.
Depending on how you interpret it. People in the past, it's easier to believe in things that we would consider bizarre because you have such a tight worldview.
Right.
But I imagine we don't give enough credit to ancient people and the metaphoric thoughts behind.
Yeah, I think so too. Absolutely.
I don't necessarily think they believed in a giant tree.
I think some of them probably did.
Well, yeah, I mean, some people did.
But I think there were, people that were definitely thinking more symbolically.
Well, yeah, it's the same as like people who take the Bible literally today versus people who take it as an interpretation of, the Christian God's word. So I think that I had this bias ahead of time thinking that all these people believed in some weird shit. But in reality, they were just trying to explain the same things that we think we know today. Right.
They were trying to explain something they didn't have answers to.
And they got weirdly close. I mean, like the idea has not changed. I shouldn't say they got weirdly close because they had the idea first, but
they were correct in their own way. Like,
yes,
in their own culture, trees, were very important because, they sustained life. So why not?
Yeah, you got to use what you know to explain the concepts.
Right. Well, let's talk about some context for modern paganism from these stories, just to wrap it up. So the creation story and descriptions of Yggdrasil are well documented compared to a lot of the other stories that we know today. The number 9 is a very important number in Old Norse because it keeps reappearing in other stories that we'll talk about later. So just for example, there were the 9 realms, and heathens used the number 9 regularly in their rituals. Yggdrasil itself as a symbolic world tree is something you'll regularly see appear on altars, book covers, and tattoos on pagans. Other important themes that pagans use from these stories are life versus death and order versus chaos. So Yggdrasil houses all life, and the tree itself is constantly dying and regrowing. It's gnawed on by different beings on the roots, branches, and trunk, but it's also constantly regrowing the parts it loses after being nourished by the wells at its roots. Life and death is seen as a cycle rather than a linear beginning and end. So all life affects the community as a whole. If one were to symbolically poison the wells of Yggdrasil, it would harm the entire tree and therefore everyone. Mm-hmm. Many heathens make an effort to preserve nature by keeping their communities and their local environments free from pollution, and this can also apply to the individual by keeping fit and staying healthy in all senses, whether it's physical, mental, or spiritual. But this one is a little more interesting. Let's talk about chaos versus order. So we already talked about how Ymir could be symbolic for the Big Bang, but a lot of other people view Ymir and the Jotnar in general as symbols of chaos. So the 3 sons of Bor, Vili, Ve, and Odin, killed Ymir and created the realms as we know them. So they built the world and brought order from chaos. And when Thor, Odin, and the other gods get into fights with giants, it can be seen as a continuing battle against chaos in order to try and keep order. This theme will continue throughout the stories of the Eddas all the way until the end at Ragnarok. And Ragnarok is a vital story and is actually one of the first to appear in the Poetic Edda. However, for this podcast, we're going to be talking about Ragnarok well into the future because there's a lot of other things we need to discuss in order to provide context for certain characters and events that appear during Ragnarok. So the theme of order versus chaos is something that many heathens will try to practice, whether it's simply keeping their altars tidy, trying to connect with nature and nature spirits, or better understanding oneself through meditation.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier that present-day followers of Norse paganism, or Asatru.
I mean, that's just one name of one organization.
Right, but they tend to hold both the beliefs in science and their religion, right? You had mentioned something similar to that earlier.
I think most would, yes.
So I wonder, how do they view the gods then? Are they real? Is Jormungandr real? Is Odin like a real being watching over you? Or is it an allegory for a scientific process?
I think...
And how do they worship then in that case?
True. Good question. I would say that very few pagans believe this is all symbolic. I think it would be very odd for someone to identify as a pagan and not worship the old gods. As actual true beings.
That are able to interact within their personal lives.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think if you want to try and merge religion with science, at least with the story we talked about today, I think a lot of people would kind of compare Odin to the Christian God. But I think there needs to be an important distinction that the Christian God is omnipotent, but Odin is definitely not. And we're going to talk a lot about Odin in the next episode and his quest for knowledge. He's always looking for information, news, and how things work, but he doesn't care about the average person and what they're up to.
So why worship him?
Because he's our creator, the Allfather, and he's very wise. We're going to talk about why next episode. But one would worship Odin if they're looking for information about something they need.
I think this is hard to wrap my head around as somebody who was raised Roman Catholic. I mean, I am not a practicing Catholic right now, but it is so ingrained in you that like God is omnipotent, God is ever present, he's always watching you and he can do anything. So that's why you can ask him for, whatever you need. But I can't picture praying to a God. Like, how do you know Odin can hear you? Or why would he bother listening to you?
Right. No, that's a very good question. I mean, everyone, I mean, like I said earlier, this is a very decentralized religion. So everyone's going to practice differently.
Yes, and I like that. That to me is comforting.
I think one thing that is a common factor in pretty much any pagan worship is offerings. You're going to be offering something to your deity. And, it's probably not going to work. Maybe it will work. A lot of people will say nothing's working because, they're their own beings. They're literally doing whatever they want to do. Who's to say they care about what you want or what you need?
Right.
So it is definitely a question of faith. I don't know.
Yeah, it's so far removed from the concepts I was raised with that I mean, it's interesting to hear about, and I'm trying to like wrap my mind around what do you believe in Odin as like a physical being? If so, are you thinking about all the details of how he can hear you and how he knows you out of 7 billion people on the planet are talking to him? Or do you just kind of not think about that?
I mean, that is definitely something I think about a lot, is how do people interpret the gods and the spirits?
Yeah.
So
everybody's got their own personal belief.
Right.
I mean, like there's no way to lump it all together.
I think it's safe to say that the Old Norse would view them as physical beings.
Sure. Just
in a different realm. I think today there's going to be many different interpretations. Maybe some do believe that and they're just on a different planet somewhere or something. Maybe Asgard is a different planet in a different solar system. I don't know. But maybe they're fourth dimensional beings or just higher dimensional beings that have, obviously a lot more power over us than the third dimension, which is why they were able to create us as humans. Or maybe they're just spirits. Maybe, they're spirits that we can't visibly see unless they present themselves to us.
Sure.
Maybe it's something we just can't comprehend. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nuances of faith, I suppose.
Right. But that is all I had for today's episode. I will say with this podcast, unlike our other podcast, A Little Spooky, also on the NerdSloth Network, which releases weekly, this is going to be released as I am able. So it's definitely not going to be months and months till the next episode, but it might be a week or two until the next episode of this podcast. But one thing I do want to say is if you do have any questions or if you want to comment on something we talked about, we have a separate email for this podcast because this podcast is going to be a lot different from the other podcasts on the NerdSloth Network. They get their own stuff that's nerdy, and this is definitely nerdy, but in a different way. I'm the only one that's slightly knowledgeable of this subject matter, so I'm the only one that can really answer any questions. So the new email is norsewoodspod@gmail.com. So send any questions you have or any comments, or if you want to talk shit about how I pronounce things, send it there.
Or if you have recommendations of what might make this a smoother podcast or what sort of organization might make a better flow. We just want to talk about Norse paganism.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting subject, and we'd love to hear other people's thoughts about it as well.
And we will definitely answer any questions or address any comments anyone has at the end of every episode.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to talk about your own experiences, if you are a Norse pagan and want to talk about your faith and maybe the deities you worship, you can definitely let us know too.
I would be very interested to hear from practicing Norse pagans, particularly people who have maybe been born into that sort of religion rather than adopted it. Or if you did adopt it, like for what reasons? Tell us your stories, man.
It would be very interesting to hear from someone that was born into it, because I'm sure that number is very low.
Yeah.
Especially since in Iceland, Asatru is such a new religion, and it's only recently been growing rapidly. So that would be very interesting if we have a listener that is in that circumstance. So let us know, and stay frosty. I think that's how I'm going to end this series. Yeah, stay frosty.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Presented by NerdSloth,
a place for lazy nerds.
If you like what you heard, consider donating at patreon.com/NerdSloth so we can continue bringing you quality shows. Be sure to also leave us a review and share your favorite episodes and clips on social media. If you're looking for more content, visit us at nerdsloth.com.